All right, hello everybody again. We're going to move on now with lecture number 12 for the endocrine system. This will be about the adrenal cortex hormones. And let's see, yes, I am recording at home today. I probably will do that pretty frequently because since I live 60 miles away from campus, it's if I can, it's easier for me to stay home on Fridays and do video lectures. I do have to warn you, those of you who have taken my Biology 201 distance class know I have two dachshunds here at home, and they do like to bark, especially at times when I don't want them barking. So if you hear any of that, that's Bert and Ernie, our two 7-year-old dachshund brothers, who are here in the room with me. All right, so we were going to move on to the next endocrine gland, which is are your adrenal glands, which, of course, sit on top of the kidneys. Kind of look like hats sitting up there on top of the kidneys. And if you have done, hopefully you have done the anatomy side already or worked through that. There's not a lot of that info for the endocrine system. And if you have, you know the adrenal glands are divided up into two major layers, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. And so if an adrenal gland kind of looks like that, the medulla is in here in the center, and then the cortex consists of a fairly thick, not super thick, but a fairly thick, more superficial portion of each of your adrenal glands. And then the cortex is itself divided into three subdivisions or layers or sublayers, probably a better way to describe it, sublayers of the adrenal cortex. And those different sublayers look differently if you investigated them under a microscope, and the cells in these different sublayers of the cortex produce different kinds of hormones. All right, so we've got lots of stuff going on here in the adrenal gland, so we'll have to divide this up into more than one video clip, and also some really interesting disorders associated with the adrenal glands as well. All right, so if you've done the anatomy side, then you've seen this already, but the adrenal cortex, as I mentioned, is divided up into three layers or sublayers. I think you can kind of, since you can consider the adrenal cortex to be a layer of a whole adrenal gland, I think it's probably better to call these sublayers. And each one has a zona name. The outermost sublayer of the adrenal cortex, right in there, is called the zona glomerulosa. And the hormones that are made by the cells in that sublayer are collectively together, they're called mineralocorticoids, because they play important roles in regulating the levels of certain mineral ions in your body fluids, primarily sodium and potassium. And we'll see more about that shortly. All right, so if you go deeper from there within the cortex, you have another sublayer. This is called the zona fasciculata, and so the cells there are arranged in strips. They almost look like curtains when you look at them under a microscope. And the cells in that area make a group of hormones that are called the glucocorticoids. Cortico is referring to the cortex, so when you see that, you know you're referring to something that's associated with the adrenal cortex. Gluco sounds like glucose, so hormones located in this area play important roles in helping to regulate glucose levels, among other things as well. And then finally, the deepest sublayer of the adrenal cortex is the zona reticularis, and the hormones made there are gonadocorticoids. So corticoid tells you it's made in the adrenal cortex, gonado referring to the gonad. So these are going to be hormones that act on the ovaries and the testes. And those are actually sex hormones that are produced at lower levels than the testes and the ovaries do in males and females, but nevertheless they are, some of those sex hormones are produced here in the adrenal cortex. All right, so the first group of hormones we're going to talk about here, we're going to talk about the hormones that are made in the zona glomerulosa. So that's the most superficial of our 3 sublayers of the adrenal cortex. All right, so mineralocorticoids help regulate mineral ions, of which there are many. The ones we're primarily interested in here are sodium and potassium ions. So, of course, when you guys take AMP1, you learn about how critical it is for the cells of your muscular system and your nervous system to maintain proper sodium levels on one side of the membrane versus the other, and potassium levels on one side of the membrane versus the other. That's absolutely crucial for the functions of your muscular and your nervous systems. So therefore, sodium ions, potassium ion concentrations have to be very closely regulated. So that's going to be the function of these hormones, controlling sodium, potassium levels in your ECF. Hopefully you've seen that before. If not, that stands for extracellular fluid. The fluid, any fluid in your body that exists outside of the boundaries of your cells. All right, and just a little bit of a review. Importance of sodium ions. Of course, sodium levels are very important for the muscular and the nervous system signaling that takes place. Sodium, though, is also the main ion that affects your ECF volume, the volume of those fluids, of your extracellular fluids. The reason for that is, you may remember from Biology 201, if you look at these different ions that are present in your extracellular fluid, sodium ions are the one that is the most concentrated. And why does this affect volume? Because water molecules, H2O, are attracted to ions. Water follows salt. Remember that from Biology 201 when you learned about osmosis. These inorganic ions many of them come from salts, so it's sometimes easy to think about osmosis as water follows salt, and it's easy to kind of think of sodium as salt. So if you have higher sodium concentrations in some body compartment, those sodium ions are going to attract water molecules. So sodium winds up being the key thing that helps control water levels in your different fluid compartments, and especially in your extracellular fluids. All right, so since that controls water volume, ECF volume, then it's going to control things like your blood volume. That makes sense. Blood is a type of extracellular fluid. The more sodium you have in your blood, the more water that will be in there, and so your blood volume is going to go up. If your blood volume goes up, what happens to your blood pressure? You have more blood pressing up against the walls of your blood vessel, so that's going to increase your blood vessel. And then sodium actually also impacts the levels of other ions in our body fluids as well, especially potassium. And the reason for that is, all right, potassium is also positively charged. Sodium is also positively charged. Another thing that your body has to maintain as part of its homeostasis is you have to have a charge balance. So you can't hang on to a lot of both sodium and potassium ions because they're both positively charged. So you can't have increases in both of those within your extracellular fluids without screwing up charges. And thinking back to Biology 201, remember those charge differences across cell membranes, extracellular versus intracellular, very important for the functions of your muscular and your nervous systems. Potassium ions, remember those, very important for the resting membrane potential of your the cells of your nervous system, your neurons and your skeletal muscle fibers. Hopefully you remember that from Biology 201. If not, you might want to go back at some point and take a look at that, because it's going to come up a little bit again when we go over the cardiovascular system. All right, so among the mineralocorticoids, the zona glomerulosa in the adrenal cortex makes several of these types of hormones, but really the most important one in human beings is one called aldosterone. it's the most potent, the most critical, the most active. So what does this hormone do? All right, so the zona glomerulosa secretes this hormone, and its target is actually the kidneys. The kidneys filter the blood and produce urine. Okay, so, and we're going to learn about the kidneys more later in the semester, but the kidneys are programmed to excrete, get rid of things you no longer need in your body fluids, like wastes or excess electrolytes, things like that. But then the kidneys are also really good at reabsorbing back into your extracellular fluids things that you don't need to urinate out. The kidneys make these types of decisions. For example, glucose. Glucose is super important as an energy source for your cells. So when your blood gets filtered in the kidneys actually initially filter all that glucose out of your blood, or filter glucose out of the blood initially, and you don't want to pee out glucose, so your kidneys have to reabsorb, recapture glucose out of the early urine before it winds up down in your bladder and on its way out of your body. So your kidneys are involved in that type of decision making that takes place. This hormone aldosterone, its job is to tell your kidneys reabsorb sodium. Okay, and if you reabsorb sodium ions and increase those levels in the ECF, water follows sodium. That's just something you guys should keep in mind in this course. If sodium levels increase, then water levels are going to increase. You're going to urinate out less water. More water is going to be retained in your extracellular fluids. All right, notice here also it says aldosterone causes elimination of potassium ions. All right, and kind of a rule is if sodium moves one way, potassium moves the other. So if your kidneys are reabsorbing more sodium ions, those are positively charged, then they have to get rid of potassium ions to make sure you keep your electrical charge balanced in your body fluids. So sodium and potassium tend to move in opposite directions. And that's something that's going to come up again in nursing school, those of you going into nursing. So you want to keep that in mind as well. You will hear quite a few of these things again. All right, what triggers aldosterone release? All right, so we said the zona glomerulosa, those cells there secrete it. And the effect, the target is the kidneys. The effect is that the kidneys reabsorb sodium ions out of the urine and back into your extracellular fluids so that you hang on to it, and then water follows. So really the goal there is to hang on to more water as well. But what triggers, why does the zona glomerulosa secrete this hormone in the first place? We're really going to cover this more when we get to the cardiovascular system, and it'll mainly be in Unit 3 when we get to that part of the cardiovascular system. For now, whenever your blood volume goes down, blood volume's down, blood pressure is down, lower blood volume, lower blood pressure. Those are key things that trigger aldosterone secretion. That makes sense because if your extracellular fluid volumes are down, your blood pressure is down, you know, what's a good way to counteract that? You increase the sodium ions in your extracellular fluids, and then the water molecules are going to follow. That's going to help. The more water you have in your extracellular fluids, you're going to have an increased volume. Blood volume goes up, you've got more blood pressing up against the walls of your blood vessels. That's going to help you maintain your blood pressure. Rising levels of potassium ions will also trigger aldosterone secretion, and that gets into, you've got to maintain proper ratios of sodium and potassium ions in your extracellular versus your intracellular fluids. If not, your nervous and muscular systems don't function properly, and you won't live very long. if things get too far out of whack. So sodium and potassium homeostasis are super, super, super critical. Another thing that can stimulate aldosterone secretion, ACTH. So that was adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that was one of those anterior pituitary hormones. And as we'll see, ACTH, so the anterior pituitary secretes that. The target is the adrenal cortex, and it is really more involved in telling the zona fasciculata to secrete its hormones. However, ACTH can trigger small increases in aldosterone production by those cells that are in the zona glomerulosa as well. During periods of stress, ACTH, as we'll see, is something that gets secreted in higher amounts when you're stressed. All right, how about some homeostatic imbalances? All right, so when we learn about these homeostatic imbalances, really throughout this course, you want to make sure you're thinking about and understanding why, based on how things function. Why does the disorder occur? Why do these symptoms of the disorder occur based on the physiology that you're learning? So there is one called aldosteronism, and this is a hyper secretion of aldosterone, so excess secretion, and it's due to an adrenal tumor. Okay, so tumors in endocrine glands, that's an overgrowth of cells in an endocrine gland. Those can be proliferative, where the cells are proliferating, or destructive. So this could be a tumor that is invading an endocrine gland and actually destroying the endocrine gland. So if you have a proliferative tumor, that means that there are cells, hormone-producing cells in the gland that are multiplying out of control, which means you're going to produce too much of the hormones that they make. And very often you lose negative feedback control. The control mechanisms wind up getting screwed up because you have far too many cells that are overproducing these hormones. So proliferative tumors tend to cause hypersecretion. Destructive tumors, where you might have a cancer that's invading an endocrine gland and actually destroying the normal cells within that gland, destructive tumors lead to hyposecretion. So you could have a proliferative tumor in the anterior pituitary that's causing overproduction of some anterior pituitary hormones, or you could have a destructive tumor there that's causing decreased production of anterior pituitary hormones. All right, so what's going to happen if you produce too much aldosterone? What's the function? The function of aldosterone is to increase sodium ion levels in our ECF. And then what's going to happen? Water follows sodium. That's basic osmosis. Water follows salt. So that leads to what? If that's happening in excess, you could develop hypertension, which is high blood pressure, because you're hanging on to too much water in your extracellular fluids. It can also lead to edema. And what's edema? That's tissue swelling. Same reason, edema. If you have excess sodium in your extracellular fluids, those extracellular fluids, yes, it includes the blood, but it also includes other extracellular fluid compartments that you have learned about, such as your tissue fluids, those interstitial fluids between your in between the cells and your tissues. So if you have excess water there, your tissues are going to swell. So those two types of things, when a patient is experiencing them, certainly not always caused by aldosteronism, but that is one of the possibilities. A sidebar there is, all right, we said if you hang on to more sodium in your extracellular fluids, you have to get rid of potassium because you got to keep the charges in balance. So if you're hanging on to too much sodium, you excrete, you're going to urinate out too much potassium. All right, and if you urinate out too much potassium, potassium is one of those key electrolytes for your nervous system and muscular system functions. So these types of patients tend to have abnormal function of neurons and muscles. So as you can see, some of that info you learned about the nervous and muscular systems back in Biology 201 is coming back in this course. All right, so that's enough about aldosterone and the zona glomerulosa hormones. And in lecture number 13, we'll continue on with some additional adrenal cortex hormones.